This is a video for homework 5, question 3, 11.1.9. So here we have to conduct a test at the alpha equals 0.01 level of significance by determining the null and alternative hypotheses, the test statistic, and the p-value. So here they're actually having you test this two different ways. There's the classical approach, that's the test statistic where we find z, and there's the p-value approach where we find p. So here, the first thing we want us to do is to choose the correct null and alternative hypothesis. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show the completed problem so you can see where I'm getting my answers here, and then we'll go through the problem together. Okay, so first of all, to choose the correct null and alternative hypothesis, whenever we have the null and alternative, the null is always going to be the equal sign, and then the alternative hypothesis will be either the greater than, less than, or not equal to sign. So in this case, because we're testing whether P1 is greater than P2, I really only have one choice here, right? So they're telling me, since this is P1 is greater than P2, that means my H sub 1 has to be this one here, and that's why we've chosen D. Okay, so first look for, because that's the greater than symbol, you want it to be your alternative hypothesis, which is this H sub 1, and you look for that alternative hypothesis, and then the null hypothesis should be the equal sign always. Okay? Now, to determine the test statistic, what we're going to do here is we're going to run the hypothesis test in StatCrunch. So I'll go to Question Help, go to StatCrunch, that'll open up for me. And here, what I'm testing is I'm testing P, which is a proportion, and it has to do with two samples. So we're comparing two samples. We want proportion 1 is greater than proportion 2. So I'm going to go to Stat, Proportion Stats, to sample, and I have the summary. I don't have all the data, I don't have all the listing of data, I just have the summary. They told me the number of successes and the number of observations for each one. So for the first sample, they're telling me x1 is 124 and n1 is 251. Remember, n will always be the sample size. Okay, so here the number of successes is 124 and the sample size is 251. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to put 124 and 251. For the second sample, I have that we have 140 for our number of successes and 319 for our sample size. So I'm going to put 140 and 319 for the second sample. Okay, now I am doing a hypothesis test. You can see here it says perform. Hypothesis test is already chosen, and I have to choose the correct one. Now notice that this looks a little different than what it does in Pearson's MyStatLab. What they're doing is they're moving P1 and P2 on the same side of the equal sign. All of them are moved to the left. So if I go over here, the way that they got this first one for our null hypothesis is that they subtracted P2 from both sides. Now here's the thing, if P1 were to equal P2, that means their difference would be 0 because they're the same number, right? So if proportion 1 is, let's say, 80%, and proportion 2 is 80%, and they're equal, their difference is 0. So that's why we have proportion 1 minus proportion 2 is 0. Now when I move this P2 in my alternative hypothesis over to the other side, the symbol is going to remain the same because I'm just subtracting from both sides. And again, because I'm subtracting P2 from both sides, that right-hand side is going to be a 0. So we're going to go over here and we're going to say P1 minus P2 is greater than 0. And then I'll just click Compute. Now here's what we got. It's given us a couple of things. It's given us the sample difference, it's given us the standard error, and here you have your z and your p-value, right? So now we can just go back here, and if you look, they have 1.31 as their test statistic, which is z0. This one is right here. And their p-value, here we got 0.0949. They wanted to round to 3 decimal places, so we have 0.095. Okay? Now, to go ahead and talk about the result of your hypothesis test, right? I honestly usually go for the p-value, right? And the little rhyme here is that if the p is low, the null must go. So that means that if the p is lower than alpha, we reject the null hypothesis, okay? So we're going to compare p to alpha. So alpha is 0.05 and p is 0.095. So p is not lower than alpha. So we do not reject the null hypothesis. Okay, so first of all, the only one that says here, right, that reject, so we're going to get rid of B. Okay, this says do not reject the null hypothesis because there is not sufficient evidence to conclude that P1 is greater than P2. And the reason that this is the answer is because see how it has quoted the alternative hypothesis. The other two are still do not reject, but they've quoted a less than and a not equal to. So we're picking the one that has the correct symbol that we had in our alternative hypothesis. So I hope that helps. As long as you know how to go ahead and get to your hypothesis testing, you can easily find your test statistic Z and your p-value.